Speaker Gingrich, since our last debate, your position in this race has changed dramatically. You are now physically at the center of the stage, which means you're at the top of the polls. Yet, many Republicans seem conflicted about you. They say that you're smart, that you're a big thinker. At the same time, many of those same Republicans worry deeply about your electability in a general election, saying perhaps Governor Romney is a safer bet. Can you put to rest once and for all the persistent doubts that you are indeed the right candidate on this stage to go up and beat President Obama?
Well, first of all, let me just say to you and to all of our viewers, Merry Christmas. This is a great time for us to be here, and I hope that everybody across the country has a very joyous Christmas season. I've been around long enough that I remember at this exact time, in 1979, when Ronald Reagan was running 30 points behind behind Jimmy Carter. And if people had said, gosh, electability is the #1 issue, they wouldn't have nominated him. What they said was, he believes what he's talking about, he has big solutions, he can get the economy growing, he understands foreign policy, and he's the person I want to have debate Jimmy Carter. He carried more states against Carter than FDR carried against Herbert Hoover in 1932. I believe I can debate Barack Obama, and I think in 7 3-hour debates, Barack Obama will not have a leg to stand on in trying to defend a record that is terrible and an ideology that is radical.
Mr. Speaker, Governor Romney just yesterday said you're an unreliable conservative. Now, obviously, he's your opponent. He's your opponent. But even Iowa Governor Terry Branstad said today he respects you greatly, but he openly questioned whether you had the discipline and focus to be president.
Well, those are two different questions. The first, let me take them one by one very quickly. I have a 90% American Conservative Union voting record for 20 years. I balanced the budget for 4 straight years, paid off $405 billion in debt, pretty conservative. The first wealth entitlement reform of your lifetime, in fact, the only major entitlement reform to now is welfare. 2 out of 3 people went back to work or went to school, pretty conservative. First tax cut in 16 years, largest capital gains tax cut in American history. Unemployment came down to 4.2%, pretty conservative. I think on the conservative thing, it's sort of laughable to suggest that somebody who campaigned with Ronald Reagan and with Jack Kemp and has had a 30-year record of conservatism is somehow not a conservative.
And what about the concerns from Iowa Governor Branstad?
I think people have to watch my career and decide. I spent 16 years working to create the first Republican majority in 40 years. I spent years helping create the first balanced budgets. I'm the longest serving teacher in the senior military, 23 years teaching 1- and 2-star generals and admirals the art of war. I think it's fair to say that my commitment to disciplined, systematic work is fairly obvious. You know, people just have to decide. Part of the difference is I do change things when conditions change, and part of the difference is I strive for very large changes, and I'm prepared to really try to lead the American people to get this country back on the right track, and that's a very large change.
There is a real drama playing out real time in Washington right now, with the threat of yet another government shutdown, the possibility that millions of Americans could see their payroll taxes go up. If you're president, as is the case now, and you're at loggerheads with one chamber of Congress, how would you handle this situation?
Well, I want to start by reinforcing what Governor Romney just said. Leadership is the key. When you have a Saul Alinsky radical who is a campaigner-in-chief who doesn't do the job of president because he's too busy trying to run for re-election, the Constitution can't work. I helped Ronald Reagan, when Tip O'Neill was Speaker, get enough votes to pass the Reagan program despite a Democratic majority. As Speaker, one of the reasons some people aren't happy with some of my leadership is I actually worked things out with Bill Clinton to get welfare reform, a tax cut, and 4 balanced budgets signed in a way that required bipartisanship because you couldn't get anything done otherwise. So leadership matters immensely in getting this done.
Speaker Gingrich, on the Freddie Mac website in 2007, you said this: I like the GSE, or government-sponsored enterprise like Freddie Mac model. Making home ownership more affordable is a policy goal that I believe conservatives should embrace. Now, in an earlier debate, a recent debate, you said that politicians like Barney Frank, who, in your words, profited from the environment that led to the financial meltdown, should go to jail. Now that it turns out that you were on the Freddie Mac payroll to the tune of more than $1.6 million, how do you answer critics who say that you're being hypocritical?
I think pretty straightforward. Barney Frank was in public office with direct power over Freddie Mac. He exploited that power, just as Chris Dodd was in public office when he got special bargains from Countrywide, a firm which went broke. They were using power. I was a private citizen, engaged in a business like any other business. Now, if you read the whole thing that they posted, I said they need more regulations. And I want to go back to my point about helping people buy houses. I worked for years with Habitat for Humanity. I think it's a good conservative principle to try to find ways to help families that are right at the margin learn how to budget, learn how to take care of a house, learn how to buy a house. And I'm not going to step back from the idea that, in fact, we should have as a goal helping as many Americans as possible be capable of buying homes. And when you look, for example, electric membership co-ops, and you look at credit unions, there are a lot of government-sponsored enterprises that are awfully important and do an awfully good job. Let me just go back to what I said a minute ago. The term government-sponsored enterprise has a very wide range of things that do a great deal of good. Go across this state and talk to people in the electric membership co-ops. Go across this state and talk to people in the credit unions. There are a lot of very good institutions that are government-sponsored. And frankly, the idea that anything which in any way has ever touched government could raise questions about doctors dealing with Medicare and Medicaid and a whole range of other government activities. There are many things governments do. I did no lobbying of any kind for any organization, and that was a key part of every agreement we had. And let me just say two things.
Speaker Gingrich, quickly.
Okay. I want to say two things. First, my policy is to break up both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It is not anything like what she just described. Second, I want to state unequivocally for every person watching tonight, I have never once changed my positions because of any kind of payment. Because the truth is, I was a national figure who was doing just fine, doing a whole variety of things, including writing best-selling books, making speeches, and the fact is, I only chose to work with people whose values I shared, and having people have a chance to buy a house is a value I believe still is important in America.
Now to Neil Cavuto with questions about the economy.
Speaker Gingrich, not to make you a target, but
it goes with being right here.
You just responded this morning, sir, tweeted originally and then with follow-up statements as a major breakthrough of this plan on the part of Republican Congressman Paul Ryan working with Democratic Senator Ron Wyden to find a sort of an updated way to keep Medicare solvent, and this would involve a choice that those who like the program as it is can stick with it. There will be a private option, et cetera. But earlier on, this might have confused Congressman Ryan and others for whom you had said with his initial Medicare fix that it was right-wing social engineering. Later on, you backed off that comment, said that there was much you could find in Mr. Ryan's plan to like. Can you blame Governor Romney for saying you have a consistency problem on this issue?
I'm not in the business of blaming Governor Romney. I'm in the business of trying to understand what we can do as a policy. If you go back and look at the Meet the Press quote, it didn't reference him. And I'll come back and say it again. A free society should make very big decisions with the support of the people. Now, you can earn that support. You can win a communications argument. Reagan was very, very good at that. But the only point I was making on Meet the Press is when you're going to have a major change, you have to communicate with the American people in order to ensure that they are for you. Now, Governor Romney came up, frankly, with a very good variation on the Ryan plan, which allowed the maintenance of the current system. Paul has adopted that, and I think it a very brave act by Senator Ron Wyden. You now have a Democrat willing to co-sponsor the bill. I've endorsed the concept today. I think it is a big step forward, and I think Governor Romney deserves some of the credit for having helped figure out a way to make this thing workable. So I think it's a nice thing to actually have a bipartisan plan in Washington that we could actually look at in a positive way and hope would help save Medicare.
Speaker Gingrich, let me start with you. You have proposed a plan to subpoena judges to testify before Congress about controversial decisions that they make. In certain cases, you advocate impeaching judges or abolishing courts altogether. Two conservative former attorneys general have criticized your plan, saying it alters the checks and balances of the three branches of government. Now, they used words like dangerous, outrageous, and totally irresponsible. Are they wrong?
Well, the first half is right. It alters the balance because the courts have become grotesquely dictatorial, far too powerful, and I think, frankly, arrogant in their misreading of the American people. There's an entire paper at newt.org. I've been working on this project since 2002, when the Ninth Circuit Court said that one nation under God is unconstitutional in the Pledge of Allegiance. And I decided if you had judges who were so radically anti-American that they thought one nation under God was wrong, they shouldn't be on the court. Now, I taught a short course in this at the University of Georgia Law School. I testified in front of sitting Supreme Court justices at Georgetown Law School, and I warned them, you keep attacking the core base of American exceptionalism, and you are going to find an uprising against you which will rebalance the judiciary. We have a balance of three branches. We do not have a judicial dictatorship in this country, and that's what the Federalist Papers promised us. And I would, just like Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, and FDR, I would be prepared to take on the judiciary if, in fact, it did not restrict itself in what it was doing.
What of the former attorneys general? These are conservative former attorneys generals who have criticized the plan, as I say, dangerous, ridiculous, outrageous, totally irresponsible.
Sure. I'd ask, first of all, have they studied Jefferson, who in 1802 abolished 18 out of 35 federal judges? 18 out of 35 were abolished.
Something that was highly criticized.
Not by anybody in power in 1802. Jefferson himself is asked, is the Supreme Court supreme? And he said, that is absurd. That would be an oligarchy. Lincoln repudiates the Judge Scott decision in his first inaugural address in 1861 and says, no 9 people can make law in this country. That would be the end of our freedom. So I would suggest to you, actually, as a historian, I may understand this better than lawyers. And as lawyers, those two attorneys general are behaving exactly like law schools, which have overly empowered lawyers to think that they can dictate to the rest of us.
Mr. Speaker, you have been openly critical of the United Nations. For example, on the topic of Palestinian efforts for statehood at the UN, you said, quote, we don't need to fund a corrupt institution to beat up on our allies. In a Gingrich administration, would the United States leave the UN?
No, but we would dramatically reduce our reliance on it, and we'd confront certain realities. People talk about a peace process. 11 missiles were fired into Israel last month. Last month. Over 200 missiles have been fired into Israel this year. Do you think if we had 11 missiles fired into the United States, well, with this president, he might well say, gee, maybe we could communicate and you would like us more. But I don't think there's, I think most of us, most Americans would say, if you're firing missiles at me, that may not be a very good gesture, okay? The United Nations camps that we have helped fund have been training grounds for terrorism. As Congresswoman Bachmann pointed out the last time we debated, she was over there with textbooks that are clearly teaching terrorism that are indirectly funded by the United States through the UN. We have no obligation to lie and every obligation to tell the truth about how bad the UN bureaucracy is and why it ought to be fixed, or we ought to radically cut what we're paying.
Our candidates, I want to move on, if we can, to energy issues. And Speaker Gingrich, I'd like to begin with you. As you know, the president, sir, has rejected any efforts to tie a payroll tax cut extension with the Keystone pipeline and to reopen it and to explore reopening it as well. He says that any other way to connect the two would be akin to adding an extraneous issue. Given his opposition and the likelihood that the Keystone issue could be up in the air for a year or more, how do you recommend Republicans deal with this to force the issue?
Neil, I sometimes get accused of using language that's too strong. So I've been standing here editing. I'm very concerned about not appearing to be zany. But I want to paint a picture for all of us. The Iranians are practicing closing the Straits of Hormuz. The Canadian Prime Minister has already said to the American President, if you don't want to build this pipeline to create 20,000 American jobs and bring oil through the United States to the largest refinery complex in the world, Houston, I'm going to put it straight west in Canada to Vancouver and ship the oil direct to China, so you'll lose the jobs, you'll lose the throughput, you'll lose 30 or 40 years of work in Houston. And the President of the United States cannot figure out that it is, I'm using mild words here, utterly irrational to say, I'm now going to veto a middle-class tax cut to protect left-wing environmental extremists in San Francisco so that we're going to kill American jobs, weaken American energy, make us more vulnerable to the Iranians, and do so in a way that makes no sense to any normal, rational American.
No offense, sir, but you didn't answer my question. What would you do to try to move on this within a year?
What should the congressional Republicans do? They should attach it to the middle-class tax cut, send it to the president, force him to veto it, send it a second time. We had to send welfare reform to Bill Clinton 3 times. He vetoed it twice. By the 3rd time, the popular outrage was so angry, 92% of the country wanted to have welfare reform, he decided to sign it. It happened to be an election year. I'd say to the president, you want to look like you are totally out of touch with the American people, be my guest, but I'm not backing down when we're right and you are totally wrong. But let me say on this whole issue of immigration, on day one, I would drop all the lawsuits against Arizona, South Carolina, and Alabama. It is wrong for the government. I would propose cutting off all federal aid to any sanctuary city that deliberately violated federal law. And I'd begin the process of completing control of the border by January 1, 2014. Those steps would begin to fundamentally change the entire behavior towards getting control of legality in the United States. Sometimes Congresswoman Bachmann doesn't get her facts very accurate. I had a 98.5% right to life voting record in 20 years. The only
go ahead.
The only difference was that they didn't like the initial welfare reform bill, which every other conservative group had said had nothing in it on abortion, period. That's the only one in 20 years. I believe that life begins at conception. The conversation we were having, which was an ABC interview, I was frankly thinking about proposing a commission to look at fertility clinics because I think there is a challenge with what happens to embryos who I think should be regarded as life because by definition they've been conceived. I am against any kind of experimentation on embryos, and I think my position on life actually has been very clear and very consistent.
Let me just respond on that specific issue.
What I said on that particular issue is I wouldn't go out and try to purge Republicans. Now, I don't see how you're going to govern the country if you're going to run around and decide who you're going to purge. The fact is, twice when I was Speaker, we moved the end of partial birth abortion. Clinton vetoed it. We worked very hard, and Rick Santorum has been a leader on this issue. I have consistently opposed partial birth abortion. I, in fact, would like to see us go much further than that and eliminate abortions as a choice. And I've said as president, I would defund Planned Parenthood and shift the money to pay for adoption services to give young women a choice of life rather than death.
Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you, Chris. Ronald Reagan famously espoused the 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican. Yet, to varying degrees, during this campaign, you've all broken that one way or another, broken that vow. So I guess the question is, how do you balance, on the one hand, trying to win the nomination, with, on the other hand, not weakening the eventual nominee to the point where he or she is less electable than President Obama? Speaker Gingrich.
Well, I think it's pretty clear if you look at my ads, if you look at my website, if you look at how I've operated in the debates, that while I reserve the right to correct attacks against me, overall I've tried very hard to talk about very big solutions, to go to the American people with a communication about what do we need to do. And I've said consistently, these are all friends of mine. Any of these folks would be better than Barack Obama in the White House. Any of them would be great in the next administration. Our only opponent is Barack Obama, and we need to come out of this process remembering beating him is what we collectively have to do. Some people say the America we know and love is a thing of the past. I don't believe that, because working together, I know we can rebuild America. We can revive our economy and create jobs, shrink government and the regulations that strangle our businesses, throw out the tax code and replace it with one that is simple and fair. We can regain the world's respect by standing strong again, being true to our faith, and respecting one another. We can return power to the people and to the states we live in so we'll all have more freedom, opportunity, and control of our lives. Yes, working together, we can and will rebuild the America we love. I'm Newt Gingrich, and I approve this message.